Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. In addition to whatever capacity you just named, I am the father of 2 kids in Massachusetts, and so have a great interest in helping the Commonwealth develop a system of public schools that can personalize for every single student, not for personalization's sake, but so that we can unlock and help every single student fulfill their fullest human potential. And so this work has a deep meaning to me as a father whose kids will be going to public schools in Massachusetts. Thrilled that Bob from Lexington Public Schools is here where we live so that we can keep pushing that work forward. So it has a deep meaning to me as we dive into this. I want to look specifically at the sort of the lingo behind this movement. And what I want to do over the next 20-25 minutes is give a tour through the education buzzwords that are emerging across the country at rapid pace. And I would say people conflating definitions, throwing things into other definitions that they were never intended to be, and generally being confusing for educators. That I think it matters, and it matters to try to sort those things out. Because, and I promise I'll only use the phrase disruptive innovation this once in this talk, but disruptive innovation has this problem that's developed over the last 20 years, which is it's become so popular that now everyone uses it not as it was originally defined, but to justify whatever the heck they wanted to do in the first place. And I think we risk the same thing with personalized learning and a whole host of other terms. And I actually thought the commissioner's remarks at the end when you were being provocative speak to that danger quite acutely. And the real goal should be success for every single student in life and career and the choices that they have for themselves. And what I like so much about the Maples personalized learning framework is it's less a definition and more a vision. And I think that's a really important way to think about it. So the first part of it, personalized learning seeks to accelerate student learning by tailoring the instructional environment, the what, when, how, and where students learn to address their individual needs, skills, and interests. This is fundamentally about figuring out whatever the right approach is for any given individual student and whatever the circumstance is. If they need direct instruction at that moment, if they need a project to go deeper and apply learning, to unlock that success. And it comes in without a notion of, we know that these are the 3 ingredients that will unlock success, but instead being honest that we know certain things about personalizing, but we have a lot more to learn, and the research agenda is going to be quite significant in this. The second piece that I love about in that second paragraph is that it recognizes that it's not just personalizing learning so that students can completely choose whatever they learn and study about, so that underwater basket weaving will be what we tour, I suspect, in Natick today. But that it's against Massachusetts' legacy and historical importance of high curriculum standards and high expectations. And I think that's a really important piece of this, and that we don't lose sight of how important that is. And the third part that I like about it is that it acknowledges the role and the importance of technology, again, not for its own sake, but as a critical ingredient to be able to do this endeavor, pull this off, at scale for every single student. And it talks about how it can augment and help the teacher role significantly in this last paragraph, not to replace teachers, but to allow them, I would say, to practice at the top of their craft. And I think that's a really important piece of this as well. Now, as you think more deeply about, okay, so that's great, that's a great vision, what is this definition then of personalized learning, and how do we know when we see it? I would submit that we have to get beyond thinking about personalized learning as a thing. I don't think it's a thing. I think we all, and great teachers today already, personalize all the time for students. And the question we ought to be asking is moving the notion of personalized learning from a noun to a verb. How are we personalizing for each and every student, and what is getting the results? And we ought to just objectively not bring our hobby horses to that table, but really think about what are the dimensions that unlock that student growth, those student objectives of becoming a lifelong learner and so forth that we want to see. And I think if we think about it this way, we can imagine that you can actually personalize among many different dimensions. And the conversation as you go into a school, into a learning environment, ought to be what dimensions are they choosing to personalize on, and what impact is that having? And this is just some of my ideas around what we see emerging in the space. So time, place, path, pace are obvious ones. Student choice over how to learn, choice over what to learn. How much does student voice and when does it make sense to bring that out more or less depending on where they are as a novice or expert learner. Learner connected, learner focused, learner demonstrated, and learner led are four concepts from Leap Innovations, a group out of Chicago that they measure personalization on, that they've decided are very important to understand. But I also think there's an effort out of Digital Promise right now that I think is personally the most interesting research-based effort, looking at, based on any given student's social emotional learning skill sets, the cognitive domain in which they're working, their executive function and their own biographical background, understanding this dimension, this sort of learner positioning system of any given student, what's the right mix, the cocktail that we ought to be delivering to that student to get the impact that we desire. Now, another term that gets tossed in, as you heard, against that personalization is competency-based learning. And to do personalized learning really, really well, my sense is competency-based learning is critical. But it's not synonymous or part and parcel with personalization by any means. It's a separate concept. And at its simplest, it's saying that our current system is fixed time and variable learning. In essence, we deliver content to students, we test and assess, and students make progress to the next grade, subject, body, material, unit, whatever it is, and only afterward get their results. And we talk a lot about data-driven decision-making in education, but the research is actually pretty unambiguous on this, which is that when you give data after the fact and after students and teachers have no ability to do something with that data, it's incredibly demotivating because you've basically given them an autopsy on their report, ignored the sense of growth mindset, and said, this is who you are as a learner, now let's move on to the next concept. If you flip that around into the other impact of this is it creates a Swiss cheese problem in education. Students develop holes in their learning, and the challenge as a teacher is you have no idea which kids in your classroom have which holes, except that you know they all have some. You flip this to a competency-based learning environment, which fundamentally flips that equation. Learning becomes fixed and time becomes the variable. And data all of a sudden takes a very different role in this system. So we offer learning experiences to students. We still test and assess, because testing and assessment is a critical part of learning. But now it's to get real-time or interactive feedback, and with which helps drive the next step in a student's learning. And students only move on once they've truly shown mastery of a given concept, skill, disposition that they're trying to master. Now, this is a definition of what high-quality competency-based learning is from Competency Works. To me, this is a great end state for thinking about competency-based learning, but competency-based learning itself isn't always high quality. It's possible to do it well, it's possible to do it poorly. And I think we have to be very clear about that and not sort of put rose-tinted glasses on as we move into these concepts. This is their definition of it. I just want to focus on one aspect of it, which is the third bullet point of assessment as a meaningful and positive learning experience for students. I think that's an important idea because as we shift into a competency-based environment, the Commonwealth has obviously taken a huge step forward with MCAS 2.0, as you were referring to. I think that there's going to be future horizons to tackle of the future of assessments, that they stop being this thing that we do at the end of the year, this block of time that's divorced from learning, and that assessments will become much smaller, they'll happen much more frequently, and they'll both be for learning, so formative in the sense that they drive what you do next, but they'll also be of learning, summative in the sense that they help give a picture of where a student is in their journey and helps create an actually more transparent and more accountable picture than we ever could otherwise imagine. And so I think it's going to blow apart in the future as we move into a competency-based system, this fight between formative and summative assessments, and say, no, assessing is driving learning constantly and helping us give the information to be able to better serve students. Quick case study on this out of higher education, Western Governors University. Online competency-based university, founded in 1999, serves 80,000 students or so now. And they basically have said there's two types of assessments. Objective assessments, which have right or wrong answers, can be delivered by machine and automated. And then there's performance assessments, where you actually want to see the rich work of applying learning in deep ways. And they create a whole separate group of faculty whose sole job is not to teach, but to help assess against rubrics and make sure that these things are valid and reliable. I think it's an important thing to be thinking about. How do we construct those environments as we move forward into the future of this environment, of next generation learning, if you will. The other piece that I'd just like to say is New England, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Maine, Vermont, all the states around Massachusetts have made a name in the last several years around competency-based learning. But if I sit back and look at it, what I think they've done a lot of is curricular reform, and not a lot of the reform of actually moving beyond a time-based system. And I think Massachusetts actually has an opportunity to drive this a lot more deeply. And really what those states have been doing is less competency-based learning and more what I would think of as deeper learning. And I think it's an important distinction, because deeper learning is another thing that I think you hear a lot about in the ecosystem right now, getting conflated with personalization, competency-based learning, and so forth. But it's actually a separate concept as well. The Hewlett Foundation, I think, usefully defined as really the skills and knowledge that students need to be successful in the 21st century. And they had 6 particular domains that are critical. The first one being mastery of core academic content. I think this is important in light of the commissioner's point about the PISA exam, because I think the way I interpreted that is knowledge is still going to matter. You can't get away from it. It's the application of knowledge matters a heck of a lot more, but you got to have that base. And there's sort of this meme around the world that, well, Google's here, therefore knowledge, you don't need it because you just look it up. But if you don't have automaticity and a basic familiarity to go deep into something, you don't know what questions to ask. You don't know how to be a critical thinker. I think I'm a reasonable critical thinker in the domain of the future of education. Put me in an engineering environment, I'm a disaster, because I just lack that basic knowledge. And so then there's a whole bunch of things that scaffold off of that around thinking critically and solving complex problems, working collaboratively, communicating effectively, learning how to learn, so developing into a lifelong learner, and developing academic mindsets, which are absolutely critical, and I think symbiotic with this world that we're talking about in this future. Now, the other phrase that gets tossed around a lot in this technology category, which I'm guilty for, is the phrase blended learning. And blended learning at its simplest is simply the mix of online learning into brick and mortar schools. And you'll certainly see that at Natick. Natick's been a long time leader in doing that work. Why I think blended learning matters is that it in and of itself is not an objective. We should not be trying to do blended learning for its own sake. We should be doing blended learning because it helps us personalize effectively at scale. We've been doing personalization for years through one-on-one tutors. The problem is most kids don't have access to that tutor. And technology gives us that capacity. And that's what's so exciting, I think, about blended learning, to personalize, and we personalize to help every student achieve success. I have the wonky definition up here that we developed at Christensen Institute, which for time's sake I'm going to skate past a little bit, but you see the online learning where students have some element of control over the time, place, path, or pace of learning, so there's a pedagogical shift to personalization. It's got to be at least in part in a school with teachers, and the modalities along each student's path have to be connected in some way. And what I mean by that is what you do online has to somehow be connected to what you're doing offline in a project or a Socratic discussion or whatnot. In other words, when I was in school in the 1980s, and a teacher would kick me out to do a little Oregon Trail for 20 minutes. How many people remember Oregon Trail? Yeah, there we go. That wasn't blended learning. It turned out that the number of squirrels and deer I killed in Oregon Trail along my path had nothing to do with the math learning that was going on. Now, what's so exciting, as I said, is this ability to unlock different pathways and paces for each individual student. And importantly, blended learning is not just simply cramming technology into the environment and hoping for the best. And You see a lot of one-to-one technology crazes continuing across the country where they're celebrating technology as an end in and of itself. My experience pretty clearly is you can do this work with 3 to 1, 3 students to 1 device, and get outstanding results if you've been thoughtful about the environment you're constructing. And to me, it's the environment, how the teacher's interacting with students through these modalities that are far more critical than the technology itself. So as the commissioner said, beaming up an electronic whiteboard with online curriculum and still lecturing haven't created that shift. Similarly, the one-to-one laptops and digital textbooks, these things can be enablers of blended learning, but in and of themselves are not that. For time's sake, I'm going to skate past this except just to say that there's a lot of different models of blended learning. It looks different in different places. We have a whole categorization scheme that my colleague Cliff Maxwell at the Christensen Institute has been maintaining at blendedlearning.org and keeping up the blended learning universe to categorize and help catalyze activity in this space. The point is, blended learning doesn't look the same, and I don't think personalized learning should look the same either. We should be, just as we should be personalizing for each individual student to help unlock what they need, each local school, each community, depending on a whole host of factors, is going to do this in different ways as well. And I don't think we should think that one is the nirvana of what this should look like. We really need to personalize it for our unique circumstances as well. Now, another term that gets thrown in there a lot with personalized learning, blended learning, is project-based learning. And I thought I'd throw that up there as well, because you'll certainly on the tours today see a lot of project-based learning, maker spaces and so forth going on in Natick. From my standpoint, this is yet again another separate concept. It's an important one, but it's separate from all the other concepts that we've talked about. The Buck Foundation, I think, has done the best definition of what project-based learning is in terms of the opportunities for students to carve out projects of meaning where they get to apply their learning in deep ways, in real-world examples. And from my standpoint, it's symbiotic with blended learning, in the sense that blended learning, a technology, is really useful at delivering that core instruction. It's not terribly useful at facilitating a rich project. You can certainly do a project online, but in and of itself is not terribly useful at being the facilitator, and that's where teachers can be so valuable. And so creating time where we can create really robust projects informed by great knowledge with the great application of that knowledge in really interesting ways, I think is the huge promise of this, and to make project-based learning far more effective than it's ever been across the country. And if you, as I do, travel to a lot of schools doing different forms of these, you see some really good project-based learning across the country, but you also see some really lousy examples of it where there's not a real depth to the projects that students are doing. And so I think we have to keep that rigor bar in mind as we go forward here. And it certainly creates some personalization in terms of how students are tackling a problem or what they're choosing to tackle on, but it can also limit it in other respects. And so I just think we have to be clear about those distinctions and see it as a vital part of what we're creating, but not, again, the end goal itself. I want to end my thoughts just on why I'm so excited about Maple itself, and then I'll turn it back to Peter to set us up for the meat of the day, the school tours, where we'll actually see this in action. But Michael Porter, famous professor at the Harvard Business School, who I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, is really one of the many things he's famous for is coining this concept of clusters, and the notion that industries tend to have geographic dimensions to it. So his famous one was the leather industry in Italy. It turns out all the suppliers and makers of leather have congregated in a very specific part of Italy. Silicon Valley is another obvious cluster in terms of the tech sector. Massachusetts has been an obvious cluster in terms of the biotech sector. And I think as we've moved into the education world and thinking about next generation learning, there's been a whole host of cities and regions that have said, how can we become the next generation education cluster, or the ed tech cluster? They all give it different names. But I think that education has been missing a few things, and that's why I think Maple is so critical. And if you look at the conditions for clusters to occur, it's not just that you have lots of entities doing the work at stake, but that you have competition. That doesn't describe education. It's not a competitive environment per se between districts in the same way that it might be in business. Cooperation. We certainly have cooperation, but we don't have the frequency of it that you might want to see in other industries where practitioners are constantly meeting and working together. Just the limits of the school day and geography make that challenging. Frequent customer-supplier interaction. So this wouldn't just be your ed tech company coming by 2 times a year to sell you and then check in on you once. But frequent interactions where you're constantly talking and giving feedback on how it's going, what's wrong, how can you improve it for my use case, and really problem solving together. Labor mobility, we obviously don't really have in the education field. And then frequent exchanges of knowledge, skills, relationships, and motivation. My sense is that not that Maple will replicate all these conditions, but that it will increase the velocity of those interactions and the set of preconditions that we need.
Natick High School, this is Julianne Kelleher and Emma Foley with your morning announcements. Please rise to the Pledge of Allegiance.
Well, should we rise?
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Art Club will be selling handmade cards and gift wrapping services. Go to room 143 before or after school.
Denton Club members will be competing on December 15th in Denton District 4 competition in Boxborough, Ennis. Wish them luck. Please donate new unwrapped toys for Toys for Tots from now until December 15th. Boxes are located in the front office, preschool, and library. Donations are entered in a raffle for a chance to win a spot in the teacher lot. That's all for your morning announcement. Thank you and have a wonderful Wednesday.
They say I'm the power of disruption. Am I good, Peter? All right. Yeah. And so I think that it's so important to really have an organization whose sole job is to create those interactions among teachers to teachers in different schools, districts, teachers to school leaders to school leaders, ed tech companies to all those people in schools, including parents and students as well, in really robust, rich ways. And I think in some sense we have to do that artificially. We have to create a dedicated organization that does that. And I think this is really the first effort we've seen across the nation where the Department of Education in the state has come together with a private organization and together said, let's do this, let's drive it. And from my standpoint, that gives me tremendous hope that we're not only doing something different, but we're doing something different that can have a real impact and informed by the research that we've seen. So I'm tremendously excited again for this frontier in Massachusetts, excited to be a part of it, excited to be a local citizen in it, thrilled with the commissioner's leadership, thrilled with Eileen's leadership. Thank you for coming on board. And Peter, I'll turn it over to you because I've been thrilled with Natick's leadership and the work you've already done and excited to see the schools. So thank you so much to all of you.